The mission was supposed to last 6 hours. It lasted 4 days. 11 soldiers went in. 1 came out. Her name was Sergeant Maya Reeves, 26 years old, from a small town in Texas called Brackettville, a place so quiet that the loudest thing you'd hear on a Sunday morning was the wind passing through the dry grass. Population, 900. 1 traffic light. And exactly 0 people who ever expected Maya to become the most talked-about name in a classified debrief held 3,000 miles away. But that is exactly what happened. And this is her story. Maya grew up the youngest of 4 siblings. Her father, a retired Army staff sergeant who served 2 tours in the Gulf War, never pushed his kids toward the military. He didn't have to. Maya watched him. She watched the way he moved through the world, with a kind of calm certainty that most people spend their entire lives searching for and never finding. She wanted that, not the rank, not the uniform. She wanted whatever it was that lived behind his eyes. She enlisted at 19, right after finishing high school. Her recruiter told her she was sharp, physically capable, and had the kind of emotional composure under pressure that most recruits don't develop until their 2nd or 3rd year of service. Maya went through basic at Fort Jackson. She was quiet in formation, precise in the field, and relentless in every physical evaluation they threw at her. She didn't make noise about being good. She just was. After basic, she went into military intelligence, spent 2 years at Fort Huachuca in Arizona, learning how to read terrain, analyze signal intercepts, and understand the psychology of adversaries. She had a gift for pattern recognition, a kind of spatial awareness that her instructors noted in her evaluations more than once. She didn't see data as abstract numbers, she saw it as a story, and she had a talent for figuring out where that story was going before anyone else did. By 24, she had been attached to a special operations support element. She wasn't Special Forces herself, but she worked closely enough with them that the distinction was largely administrative. She had been in Jordan, in Qatar, in the northern regions of Iraq. She had done her job quietly and professionally and come home each time without incident. The fall of 2025 would be different. Tensions along the Iran-Iraq border had been escalating for months. A new network of Iranian-backed proxy forces had begun operating in the region with a level of coordination and intelligence sophistication that alarmed analysts on both sides of the Atlantic. Someone, somewhere, was feeding them information, targeting data, movement schedules, the kind of operational intelligence that doesn't come from open-source channels. An asset, a man known internally only as Source 14, had spent 18 months embedded inside this network. What he had collected was, according to the officers who briefed Maya's team, potentially the most significant intelligence package acquired in the region in over a decade. Names, infrastructure maps, financial routing, communication protocols. If they could get Source 14 out before his cover was blown, they could dismantle the entire network from the inside. The extraction window was narrow. 48 hours. They had a route, a fallback, and a contingency for the contingency. Maya's role was to accompany the 11-man special operations element as their intelligence specialist, the person who would translate Source 14's raw information in real time and determine whether what he was handing over was authentic. They inserted via helicopter, low and fast, 20 kilometers from the border. The landing zone was a dry riverbed that satellite imagery had confirmed was empty for 72 consecutive hours. They hit the ground at 02:15. Conditions were good. Wind was negligible. The first 4 kilometers went exactly as planned. Then the radio crackled. One of their forward scouts, a sergeant named Caleb Torres, reported movement 2 kilometers to the northeast. Not just a patrol, a full blocking force, vehicles, at least 30 personnel, positioned directly between the team and their extraction route. Someone had known they were coming. The ambush hit them 12 minutes later. It began with a single rocket-propelled grenade that detonated 15 meters from the lead element. The blast took out 2 men instantly. What followed was a coordinated, well-rehearsed kill box. Fire from 3 directions, designed to push the team into a compressed kill zone where a 4th element was waiting. Maya had been near the center of the column when the first explosion hit. She went down hard, not from the blast but from the shock wave, knocked off her feet, ears ringing. The world tilted sideways for 3 seconds that felt like 30. She got up. She looked left. She looked right. She started moving. The team's captain, a man named Rodriguez, was on the radio calling in the contact when the second grenade hit. He went down. The comm sergeant took shrapnel to both legs. Within 4 minutes of first contact, the team had taken 7 casualties, 3 dead, 4 wounded and unable to move under fire. What remained were 4 soldiers in any condition to fight. Maya, a staff sergeant named Hicks, a demolition specialist named Park, and a combat controller named Walsh, who had taken a graze across his left arm but was still functional. They fell back to a rocky outcropping 200 meters southeast. Hicks was taking fire from the northern ridge. Park was laying suppressive fire to the west. Walsh was trying to get air support on a backup frequency while his primary radio had been destroyed in the second explosion. Maya was doing 3 things simultaneously: returning fire, trying to assess which wounded could be moved, and processing the tactical situation fast enough to give the others something to work with. They held that position for 6 hours. By dawn, only Maya and Walsh were still conscious and mobile. Hicks had been hit in the chest in the 5th hour. Park had taken a round to the shoulder and lost consciousness from blood loss. Walsh had his radio. He had partial contact with a relay station 60 kilometers away. But the signal was degraded. The location data was imprecise, and any rescue would take time they didn't know they had. Walsh told Maya he could hold the position for another few hours if they didn't move. Maya looked at the terrain. She looked at the enemy movement patterns she had been tracking since the ambush began, and she made a decision. She told Walsh to stay with the wounded. She was going to draw them off. What followed over the next 72 hours is the part of this story that defies simple explanation. Because what Maya did was not the product of a single heroic moment. It was a sustained, methodical, exhausting act of survival and resistance that she executed almost entirely alone, in terrain she had only studied on maps with limited ammunition, no food, and a radio that could receive but could not reliably transmit. She moved east, away from Walsh and the wounded. She made noise when she needed to, drew patrols toward her position, then vanished before they could close the distance. She used the topography the way a chess player uses the board. Every ridge, every dry wash, every shadow was a tool. She had studied this kind of terrain in training. She had analyzed dozens of evasion cases in her intelligence work. But studying something and living it are 2 different things entirely. On the first night, she encountered a 2-man patrol at close range. She had no choice. She neutralized both of them. She took one of their radios, damaged but partially functional, and used it to listen to their communication traffic. She didn't speak Farsi fluently, but she had enough working knowledge from her intelligence training to understand the pattern of what they were saying. They were organizing a sweep. 4 elements, moving in a tightening grid. She stayed ahead of the grid. On the second day, she found a collapsed agricultural structure, half a stone wall and the remnants of a roof. She stayed there through the hottest hours of the afternoon, conserving energy, listening to the radio, mapping the patrol movements in her head. She had a granola bar in her left cargo pocket. She ate half of it. She saved the other half. On the second night, the temperature dropped to near freezing. She had no cold weather layer. She did what the survival manual tells you to do, and what almost nobody actually believes will work until they try it. She kept moving. Not fast, controlled, enough to maintain core temperature. She moved in patterns that kept her near the edge of the patrol zone without crossing into it. By the morning of the 3rd day, she had covered nearly 30 kilometers of broken terrain. She was running on almost no sleep, minimal calories, and the kind of focused mental state that the human body produces in extremis, a clarity that burns bright and doesn't last. She found a position on a low ridgeline overlooking a dry riverbed. She could see 300 meters in either direction. She set up there. She assessed her ammunition. She had 1 magazine and a half, 17 rounds total. She got on the partial radio. She transmitted her coordinates. She didn't know if anyone received it. Then she waited. In the debriefs that followed, conducted over 3 separate sessions with a team of Army psychologists present for the last 2, Maya was asked repeatedly about the moment that defined the action. What was she thinking when she called in her own position? Her answer was consistent every time. She said, "I wasn't thinking about dying. I was thinking about the math." The math, as she described it, was simple. Walsh and the wounded had now been alone for over 60 hours. Any rescue effort would need a precise location. Her radio couldn't give them one reliably. But if she called in her own position and made enough noise, enough contact, the enemy would respond with enough visible force that any surveillance asset overhead could track the convergence point. They would find the fight. And if they found the fight, they would find the area. And if they found the area, they would find Walsh. That was the logic. She also said something else, something the debrief report noted directly. "I figured if I was going to go out, I'd rather go out doing something that mattered." Sitting still waiting to be found didn't feel like doing something that mattered. At approximately 0340 on the 4th day, 2 patrol vehicles moved into the riverbed below her position. 7 personnel total. They had triangulated her radio signal. Maya Reeves had 17 rounds. She used 14 of them. When the rescue helicopter touched down 40 minutes later, directed to the area by a combination of her partial transmission, enemy radio traffic, and a surveillance drone that had been repositioned based on Walsh's last known coordinates, they found her behind a boulder with 3 rounds left, 2 enemy fighters down at the base of the ridge, and 5 more who had withdrawn after taking fire from an angle, an elevation they hadn't expected. Walsh was alive. Park was alive. Hicks did not survive the night of the ambush. 2 others from the original team were recovered and evacuated. Source 14 was never extracted. The window had closed on the 2nd day. Maya was medically evacuated to Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany. Dehydration, hypothermia, a stress fracture in her left foot from the terrain and the distance, and a laceration across her right forearm from the initial ambush that she had field-dressed herself and not mentioned to anyone until the flight medic found it. She spent 11 days at Landstuhl before being transferred back to the United States. The action was classified. There was no press conference. There was no medal ceremony broadcast on the evening news. The families of the men who died received visits and condolences that contained almost no specific details about what had happened or where. Maya went home to Brackettville for 2 weeks. She sat on her father's porch. She drank coffee. She didn't talk much about what had happened, and her father, who understood better than most what it meant to carry something like that, didn't push. She returned to duty 60 days later. She asked to be reassigned to a forward support element. Her request was approved. There is a particular kind of courage that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with a speech or a dramatic gesture. It shows up at 2 in the morning in a dry riverbed in a country most people couldn't find on a map. And it just does what needs to be done. And then it comes home and sits on a porch and drinks coffee and doesn't make a big deal about it. Sergeant Maya Reeves never made the front page. She never gave an interview. She never told her story on a podcast. If you searched her name, you would find nothing. But somewhere in a classified document that very few people will ever read, there is a line that describes what she did in those 4 days. And the people who wrote that line, the ones who have seen enough to know the difference between someone who talks about courage and someone who lives it, they know exactly what that line means. Now, so do you. There are things about that mission that will never be fully known. The classified nature of the operation means that most of the details, the names of the men who didn't come back, the exact coordinates, the intelligence that was never recovered, will stay buried in files that the public will never see. That is the nature of this kind of work. You do it in the dark, and the dark keeps it. But some things don't stay buried. Not entirely. because the people who were there carry them, and people who carry things long enough eventually find ways to let a little of it out. Not in press conferences, not in books, but in quiet conversations, in the way someone pauses before answering a question, in the particular kind of silence that falls over a room when someone who has been through something real is asked to talk about it. One of the soldiers who was evacuated from that mission, a man who asked not to be named, said something in a private conversation that has stayed with the people who heard it. He said, "There are soldiers you serve with, and then there are soldiers you would follow anywhere. Maya Reeves was the second kind, and the thing about the second kind is that they don't know they are. That's exactly why they are." Maya, for her part, went back to work. She did her job. She trained the next group of soldiers who came through. She wrote her after-action assessments with the same precision she had always brought to everything.